You see, God does call us, and so often we do dig our heels in. Now today, we're going to go back to another Old Testament. This summer, we've been doing the stories of the Old Testament. We're going to go back to Jonah in the Old Testament, and he was called to take a huge step of faith. And he dug his heels in and said, no, now, I'm assuming most of you know the story of Jonah. He was called to go to a city called Nineveh. He was called to go preach that God was coming and give them a warning. And he didn't want to go, so he got on a ship to go to another place. He ended up getting tossed off the ship. He ended up in the belly of a whale, got spit up on the ground, and then, and only then, did he say, yes, I'll go. So he went through this process. So that's a quick summation of the story of Jonah in the Old Testament. Jonah was he was from the Hicks. He was out in the country. He was in a farming community. He was from a small little place. His culture was different than Nineveh. His community, his country was different. The kingdom of Assyria ruled the world, and he was coming into this big place, and he was called to leave his little tiny place, and he was called to be the voice of God in a city 550 miles away that was completely different. Now look what Jonah did. Let's look at this next slide on a map, okay? So that you can understand what Jonah did. So Jonah was called to go 550 miles. Now that's a long way at the time, but he was called to go 550 miles to Nineveh, okay? Instead, he said no to God, so he decided to take a 2,500 trip to Tarshish. Now does this make any sense to you at all? Now you look at that map and you smile and you laugh, but we've all done the same thing. God calls us to do something. Maybe he calls us to get involved in a service. Maybe he calls us financially to do something. Maybe he calls us spiritually to do something. But yet we spend incredible amounts of our energy and our time, and we travel long distances in the other way to go around what God has called us to be and what God has called us to do. When we decide not to do what God has called us to do, when we run away from God, it begins to hurt people. We hurt ourselves. We hurt others. We hurt those that we care about, and they get hurt. Look at Jonah. He put a whole ship in danger going to Tarshish because he was afraid of God. God calls Jonah and says, I want you to go and I want you to preach and I want you to give this city a warning. God wants us to be obedient. God will take the results from our obedience. We don't need to worry about that. What we need to focus on is saying yes to God. That's all God wants. He just wants us to say yes.